everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade and I am the Director of Social Science Matrix. I am pleased to welcome you to our book talk today devoted to Brandi Summers' Black in Place, the Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City. For those of you new to Matrix, we are a cross-disciplinary social science institute. Today's event is part of our Authors Meets Critics series, which features critically engaged discussions about recently published books by social scientists at UC Berkeley. For each event, the author discusses the key arguments of their book with fellow scholars. If you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters and to check out our events page. We have some very exciting events lined up this fall. In November, we'll be showcasing Professor Rosemary Joyce's book, The Future of Nuclear Waste, What Art and Archaeology Can Tell Us About Securing the World's Most Hazardous Material. We also have another series of programs, which we call Matrix on Point. These are panel discussions on urgent matters of the moment. In the coming weeks, we have panels dedicated to a number of important topics, including the pandemic election in the United States, the rise of democratically elected authoritarians around the globe, the economic impacts of COVID-19, and climate migration and refugees. In a moment, I will introduce today's panelists who will each offer brief comments about major takeaways from the book and its central argumentation. They will engage each other in conversation before entertaining questions from the audience. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our two guests. Brandi Thompson Summers is Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Metropolitan Studies at UC Berkeley. She received her PhD in Sociology from UC Santa Cruz and a master's degree in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago. Her research engages theoretical themes that cut across multiple domains of social life. She builds on epistemological and methodological insights from cultural and urban geography, urban sociology, African American studies, and media studies by examining the cultural, political, and economic dynamics by which race and space are reimagined and reordered. She has published several articles and essays that analyze the relationship between race, power, aesthetics, and urbanization that appear in both academic and popular publications, including the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, ASAP Journal, New York Times, Boston Globe, Public Books, and The Funambulist. And of course, she's the author of today's book. Brandi will be joined in conversation today by Nikki Jones. Nikki is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Her work focuses on the experience of Black women, men, and youth with the criminal justice system, policing, and with various forms of violence. Professor Jones is the author of two books, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence from 2010, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption from 2018. And that last one was named a 2018 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Her current research efforts are focused on the systematic analysis of video records that document routine encounters between police and civilians, with a focus on encounters that involve the police and Black youth in high surveillance neighborhoods. These records are housed in the Justice Interaction Lab in the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Professor Jones is also a faculty affiliate with the Center for Race and Gender, the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and the Center for the Study of Law and Society. Please join me in a warm, though virtual, welcoming of Professor Summers and Jones.
Thank you for that the introduction, and thank you and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the Social Science Matrix, to Marion and Jessica for the invitation to be in conversation with Professor Summers about her work. I know Chuck is in the background. Thank you to Chuck for being there for our logistical support. And of course, thank you to Professor Summers for writing such a wonderful book, such a thought-provoking book, an illuminating book. It was a pleasure to read, and I very much look forward to our conversation today. And I would very much like for this to be a conversation, as I've shared with Professor Summers and Jessica before this event. When I was invited to participate in the Author Meets Critics, I said yes, very enthusiastically, because it's a book that I wanted to read and a conversation I wanted to be in. But I also shared that I didn't love the idea of a traditional Author Meets Critics session. You know, it's standard fare in the academy. We know that. But it represents a particular way of producing and consuming knowledge. It doesn't always align with the Black feminist politics that I like to bring into the space, or even Black feminist modes of critique. I do think that critique is an art. I am not trained as a critic in that way. So, you know, I show up in this space not as a critic of what has been thoughtfully and carefully produced, but as a co-constructor of knowledge, as a person who has engaged with your work and your ideas and is poised to engage with you around those ideas and others who are able to join us today. And to also learn from that conversation. So that's the space, the virtual space that I hope we can enter into today in the time that we have together. Marion said we will start today with an introductory set of comments from Professor Summers on her book, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City. I'll then take about 10 to 12 minutes to share some of my own comments and then to kind of bring us into a question and answer session, starting with first a conversation between myself and Professor Summers. I have a couple of questions pulled out. I have a whole list of questions, but I'll start with just two. And that will then, we'll have that conversation, and then that we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So folks, as you have questions, please add them to the Q&A feature. And so Professor Summers, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And I also want to echo your thanks to Jessica, especially for organizing this, Marion for the wonderful introduction, the social science matrix altogether, Chuck again for the technical expertise, and then Nikki for doing this while on sabbatical. I am just so grateful for you being here, even though we're stuck here, but still to take your time, it means a lot to me. I'll try to be brief and just talk a little bit about the book, or at least my intentions for the book. It's always challenging to let something go and then wonder how it's going to be taken up. And that's especially the case I learned with the book. I've learned so many ways that people have taken up my work in some incredible, like they've read it differently, and I love it. It pushes me, it has me think more about my next projects, but then also to really rethink how I was trying to put my voice out there and really just speak about a lot of observations I had made while I was living in Washington, D.C. So just to start, you know, in the book, I'm really describing this changing historical role of Blackness and its interaction with processes of gentrification. So I'm using this pretty small space, it's 8th Street, it's this commercial corridor, to tell a much wider story about cultural change, about racial conflict, also about capital flows, and about governance. And so I felt it was important to think about the historical origins of this kind of contemporary shift, more so in the 20th century, in political economy and the racial geography of DC, and how that gets played out in one location. I wanted to take this hyper-local focus because I think you're better able to see the nuances and the patterns that hold narratives together, and you can better see the inner workings of power and imagination when you look at a small geography and unpack various elements that contribute to the production and the management of space. So I thought 8th Street perfectly illustrates this problem that emerges when Black areas are essentially primed for revitalization. So, as I was doing my research, this is in part my dissertation research, but certainly not most of it. And so I really had to do a lot of work to really extend this and make it a book. But the work on gentrification that I had read really did, it incorporated these questions of race especially as it's thinking about gentrification, but it rehashed these old tropes of what James Baldwin in 1963 famously said after visiting San Francisco, what he called Negro removal. And so he, you know, the people, he made this claim in 63, but the people who are talking about gentrification today are really borrowing from those debates about urban renewal. And so in my book, you know, what I'm trying to show is something that, you know, as laden with politics as urban development can, through this series of well-manicured projections of Blackness, take on this appearance of race neutrality or just neutrality generally. So I'm using Blackness as this central analytic to really understand how racism shapes Black life and how these liberal proclamations of neutrality or race neutrality, or even really just using the general term race, also these calls for diversity, only serve to marginalize and ultimately displace Black people. So in the book, I'm really showing how Blackness is intermittently and it's simultaneously pathologized, it's celebrated, it's invisibilized, it's also sanitized for capital, and it ends up being subsumed under this capital-friendly umbrella of diversity, which, you know, we see in multiple institutions, but we're also seeing this in various urban spaces. So overall, to make claims, general claims about the threat of neoliberal capital in the displacement and the dispossession of Black people, I'm pointing to these economic, cultural, architectural, and political structures that contribute to this perpetuation of racism and conditions of racial inequality in DC. Theoretically, I propose the term Black aesthetic emplacement, or BAE, as a way to think about how Blackness is aestheticized and what I say, just deployed to fortify public order and organized landscapes, literally, as well as foster capital. And this happens really through this hegemonic capitalist structuring and a signifying of ideas about Blackness to really increase the desirability of coming to a particular neighborhood or really coming to the city. And so this means that there are these strategies that incorporate Blackness as an aesthetic. And in the book, I'm really clear. I don't mean Black aesthetics as in Black cultural production. I'm thinking about Black aesthetics separately, where Blackness operates as an aesthetic that's essential really to gentrification as an urbanizing process, and can really be seen in, you know, clearly in institutions that provide daily life or daily services. So, you know, if we think about this urban landscape, you know, as being produced in ways that necessitates the visibility of Blackness, but also operates alongside the displacement of Black people and those enterprises that cater to poor and working class Black residents. In the book, I'm really, you know, in my work, trying to document these everyday quotidian expressions of the symbolic takeover of Blackness. I'm trying to be really thoughtful in my depiction of the transformation of the nation's capital and part of broader happenings in urban communities around the US and really around the world. Again, in DC in particular, you know, in recent years, we've seen Blackness be drafted into the service of capital. So while you know, it's a unique place, it's the nation's capital, it's the first chocolate city, it's also similar to so many metropolitan areas in the US. And we can really think about the Bay Area in that context too. So I thought it was really important to share this long arc of its contemporary history to understand the ways that, you know, governments, infrastructure, and in a lot of ways, ideology shape Blackness and how it remains ever present in this discursive framing of the chocolate city and its afterlife, what I'm calling the post-chocolate city. So the transformation of H Street really exemplifies this dismantling of the Black city. It's this disappearing mode of social and cultural life that's been revised and remade by this aesthetic infrastructure. And the book really, you know, focuses on the contours of contemporary racism and I think provides this framework through which we can imagine ways to study this dismantling or even a deterritorialization and an eventual reclamation of the Black city. So if we think about, you know, the ways that people imagine a so-called Black space and the ways that's been structured or even predetermined by interlocking discourses that don't consider diverse or diffuse expressions of Blackness. And if we think about it, our neighborhoods and their design and in their state management really reflect those unspoken assumptions. And what I'll say, as it relates to the current moment, and this is what I'll say in closing, what a friend of mine calls the pandelution or the revolemic, which is this combination between the pandemic and the racial revolution. There's this resurgence of public life that speaks to how Blackness is represented in the city, and in the ways that we ultimately cut corners to celebrate Black life, but we're not necessarily invested in Black living. And so I think this is really taking an opportunity for us to open up these designations and recognize, historically what we've done to preserve certain structures that ultimately, like I said, displace, dispossess, and really create this political representation of Blackness that doesn't really encompass the totality of Black life. And I think there's real potential now. So that's what I'll say now.
Yes, thank you. I was taking down more notes as you were talking. I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the conversation as well. So thank you again for writing this book. I have to say, and I think other folks can feel this, it's not an easy time to read a book, right? And I started this book in the before times because we were originally scheduled to have this conversation pre-COVID and pre-summer 2020. But of course I went back and read it closely in preparation for today's conversation. And I really appreciated the time I had to spend with this book for a number of different reasons. I appreciate the opportunity because it reminded me of the city, right? Of the city as a site that does not exist in the same way now as it did then, in part because the patterns of interaction that were, as you write, in part constructed by capital, have been disrupted, interrupted, and forestalled. I don't even know if that's, any of those is the exact right word, but the city is different now. And yet the city that you write about is a city I remember, right? So a DC I remember and didn't quite understand it as it was transforming into what it was today during the time that you were there. So I appreciate your telling of the city's past and its present, and how the city's past lives in its present, and how it is manipulated into its present form, and what that means for the futures, plural, of what you describe as the post-chocolate city. I also appreciate the choices that you make as an ethnographer, where you decide to train your eye when it comes to the making and remaking of the city and the place of Blackness and Black people in that space. I appreciate the way that space is the main character, right? The key respondent in this book. And I thought about this again and again as I was reading the text, because this is a book that I once thought of writing, and I'll say a little bit more about that, right? So when I was thinking about a site to ground my study as an urban ethnographer back in 2004, 2005, I had this fleeting idea about a comparative ethnography between DC and San Francisco. And some folks will know that the book that was just published in 2018, The Chosen Ones, Black Men, the Politics of Redemption, is based in the Fillmore neighborhood of San Francisco. So you can imagine what I was thinking about as I was reading your book, because so many of the processes are so similar. But if I had done that, it wouldn't have been this book, right? Because I would have chosen U Street, right? A more visible and accessible site of gentrification, because it was a place that I was familiar with, and you very decidedly did not choose U Street because of your interest in the quotidian and the mundane. And I love that you made that choice. And also, I focus on interpersonal interaction, the interaction order. So I simply would not have done the thing you do here quite masterfully, which is to make spatial relationships, the relationship between space and capital, and in turn, the relationship between space, Blackness, and capital, a main point of entry into the story of H Street. For me, the workings of commercial real estate would have been the backdrop, right? The setting. But in your hands and with your eye and through your analysis, we see space in a way that challenges and necessarily reaches beyond what might be produced in the hands and minds of another scholar, and certainly within the constraints of sociology. And as I was reading the book, it's just a good reminder that who you are as the ethnographer matters, right? Who you are entering into the space matters. And I tell my students that you can have two people who go to the exact same space and not going to tell the exact same story, right? Because who you are matters so much to the work. As you say in the introduction to the book, and I'll quote this, sociologists can take space for granted, right? They can do so in ways that flatten the various ways that Blackness shows up in the city. You write, quote, as a sociologist, I often struggle to make Blackness legible to a field that makes it singular. I'm in a conversation where Blackness is the foreground through which I am writing, right? Not the background, right? The foreground through which I'm writing, rather than Blackness being the case as in sociology. So in not taking space for granted, as I said, you create a way of seeing relationships, structural, economic, social, that exist but aren't accessible solely through the tools or training of social science generally. And doing so, you provide a model not for the one way to see Blackness in the city, but a multiplicity of ways to see Blackness, and to highlight what I think is an important point in the book, to see Black people in spaces where they and we, right, are necessary yet unseen. And I love that the term unseen, and it's something that I'll come back to in the Q&A, or in our conversation first. In fact, you show us quite convincingly how Blackness is made to be seen in the city in ways that are increasingly untethered from the visual presence of actual Black people, untethered from Black life as it is lived. So as you argue, in a place where Blackness operates on the level of aesthetics, places like Chocolate City Beer, right, which is, as you say, is owned by two white guys, stands in for a marker for a post-chocolate city in a way that makes sense, or is made to make sense, right? And your reading of the Chocolate City Beer logo, right, along with the analysis of each chapter of the book, provides an elegant argument of how Blackness shows up in the city. To quote you, Blackness as taste, Blackness as struggle, Blackness as nostalgia, right? Blackness acts as an engine of profit. Blackness is quote, the illusion of inclusion within the culture of modern capital. And you help us to see by providing a language for seeing, right? So what you describe as a critical vocabulary for helping us to not only understand this process, but to also think about, as you write, quote, how to contest burgeoning inequalities, right? And so you give us, as you mentioned, the vocabulary of Bay. I didn't think about that as I was reading. Black aesthetic emplacement, right? Which you define as, quote, a mode of representing Blackness in urban capitalist simulacra. Wait, say it. Say it, I'll repeat it.
Simulacra.
Simulacra. And I had it broken down, thank you. Which exposes how Blackness accrues a value that is not necessarily extended to Black bodies. My spell check was like, when I was taking these notes, my spell check was red, underlined the whole time. Aesthetics, right, is what we see and feel. And reading your work, it also reminded me of the smell of the modern city, at least pre-COVID. I remember when I lived in downtown Oakland in Domain by Alta, and the lobby, it's one of these new developments similar to Avec that you write about, right? And the lobby had a constant like fragrance, right? So you would walk off the city street into this, right, whole new environment that was created for a particular kind of feeling, right? And you make the point that in the drift from a chocolate city to a post-chocolate cosmopolitan metropolis, Blackness acts as the aesthetic infrastructure of gentrification. Blackness becomes a way to signal order, to organize landscapes, and to foster capital. And in that process, there's an erasure. Black cultural imagery takes an iconic form. It becomes a part of a logo, as you say, which explicitly depoliticizes and aestheticizes an important history of resistance, while also opting out of using Black bodies in the process. And this was it for me, right? This is, you know, the kind of the sentence, a key takeaway, right? A Blackness that doesn't rely on Black people. And it's such a wonderful way of describing that process and that experience, that feel in the city, that, as you said, we can also bring into other institutional settings, right? That also rely on this conversation around diversity, right? And also are also influenced by flows of capital and are trying to create a new race neutral kind of space. So we feel the ability of capitalism to conjure but not confirm Blackness in a way that, as you write, reflects the privilege of whiteness to take Black space and anchor its connection to Blackness for profit. And we know that Black people can also participate in that process. And there are points in the book where you both show that and explain how that is so quite well. So the book is a story, a history of how post-racial discourse and neoliberal urban development convert Blackness into a prized aesthetic. The book shows us how a city becomes cool through Blackness, even as the population of Black people in the city declines. And you know, we know this decline is happening, and still it was striking to me to see the numbers where you see this embrace of Blackness as the percentages are declining. And so just for folks who haven't read the book yet and are interested, in the 1990s, Black people in DC, 77% of the population, right, down to 73% in 2000, 45.2 in 2010, and I'm not sure where it is now. And from 2000 to 2010, you have the white population increasing from just under 23% to almost 48%, right? So it's a story not just about the act, but the business of placemaking, of making a cool city. What is sold, often sold by white people, sometimes by white superheroes. I love that part of the book, saving the block, right? But not always white, as I said. What they sell, what they profit off of is an iconic Blackness, but not actual Black people. Actual Black people are held in place and are simultaneously out of place. And as you say, this is something that we can feel as we move through the city, right? But you show us, right, through the case of commercial real estate, how this feeling is constructed and the place of Blackness in that construction. So in addition to providing new concepts like Black aesthetic and placement, you also bring clarity to commonly used terms like neoliberalism and gentrification. I will tell you, if any of my students are out there will watch this, they come to me talking about neoliberalism and I'm like, define it, right? You cannot just use the term. And so I so appreciate the very clear example. I will tell folks just to look at your book, right, and to model it, and also gentrification, right? And so as someone who teaches on gentrification, I'm often helping students to understand how gentrification and urban renewal are distinct, right, yet overlapping processes. I'm especially appreciative of the time you spent defining the concept and the critical racial analysis you bring to the literature on gentrification, right, which is, as you said, not only about the displacement of Black people, right, but as you write, is a process that relies on neoliberal logics. And again, you do a very good job of outlining what those specific logics are and how they matter for H Street to reconfigure urban space. Right, you describe gentrification as, quote, the investment of public and private capital into prevailing disinvested neighborhoods, primarily inhabited by poor and working class Black people, and that which precipitate the social and physical transformation of the built environment. That transformation, the transformation of H Street, reveals, right, how race operates as aesthetic language and a visual logic, right? And that's your words. Gentrification encourages, requires in this moment the stylization and commodification of race, and specifically of Blackness, right? As you write, Blackness is visually consumed, and that is its value in the geography of gentrification, right? And so through your analysis, we understand gentrification not as a natural process, right, as some people imagine and argue, but as a process that operates in the currency of cool and produces profits for a few and precarity for many more, and especially for Black folks. And so in each of the chapters, in chapter 1, you take us through H Street as a former riot corridor. Chapter 2, focusing on diversity as an antidote to Blackness. Chapter 3, looking at race and nostalgia. Chapter 4, your discussion of authenticity. And chapter 5, Blackness in public space. You provide a case study in the construction and commodification of the aesthetics of gentrification in a post-chocolate city and its consequences. And it's such a rich and dense, right, and dense in the best way, right, dense but accessible book, right, that we don't have enough time to talk about all of it now. So I want to spend a little bit more time on 2 of the chapters and use these chapters as an entry into our conversation. And so I'll say a little bit about each of the chapters, and there'll be a question that I have, and then we can come back to each of those questions to open up our conversation. And again, if folks have questions, please use the Q&A feature as well. So the 2 chapters I'll talk about for a couple moments. Chapter 1, capital reinvestment, riot, renewal, and the rise of a Black ghetto. And chapter 5, spatial aesthetics and Black bodies in place. And so chapter 1 introduces us to the H Street corridor, the setting for your study. And we learn that H Street has a really interesting history that is rooted in both a kind of diversity and segregation, right? You use what is called the former Riot corridor as a site to examine, as you say, quote, the development and designation of H Street as Black space, and how the intersection of urban development, Black capitalism, local policy, and the racialization of public space operate to construct H Street after the uprisings of the 1960s as blighted, slum, right, and a ghetto, which then justifies the abandonment of the state during one period of time and the retaking of that space decades later. So in the chapter, you make sense of the time before the rebellions in a city that was considered by some to be riot-proof, right? But those assessments ignored the routine forms of exploitation, economic exploitation that Black people were subject to in the time before the uprisings. And as I was reading the chapter, especially your analysis of looting, right, I couldn't help but think of the moment that we're in, right? A moment following a summer in which 25 million people participated in protests against systemic racism and police violence. 93% of those protests were in fact peaceful, and yet there was also violence and the kind of property destruction that we've seen before and that defy the simple narratives that often circulate to explain what happened. And so what we've seen feels and doesn't feel like what we've seen before, right? I'm thinking about Minneapolis and the Target store that was located in the 3rd precinct where George Floyd was killed, right? That was destroyed. In New York City, a group of people protect the Target, right? There's a headline, protesters form human chain to defend New York City Target from looters. What is that about, right? We're gonna talk about that in a second, right? And then you also have this statement from the Target CEO, a statement that starts with Blackness and an alignment of this corporate entity with the community. And so I'll just read the first few sentences from that statement. From the Target CEO, right? We are a community in pain. That pain is not unique to the Twin Cities. It extends across America. The murder of George Floyd has unleashed the pent-up pain of years, as have the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. We say their names and hold a too long list of others in our hearts. As a Target team, we've huddled, we've consoled, we've witnessed horrific scenes similar to what's playing out now, and wept that not enough is changing. And as a team, we vowed to face pain with purpose. So that's the Target CEO, right? The Target store in Minneapolis is reopening in November. And so the question, and I'll share the question now, and then I'll say something about chapter 5, and then we can open it up. But how do we make sense of this relationship, right? How does your work help us to make sense of what we have seen, right, over the course of the summer? How do we build on your analysis to make sense of the way that Blackness is being used here and has been used by other companies over the course of the summer in its attempt to align with the community in the protection of Target in Brooklyn and Target's decision to reopen in the future of these cities? What does this mean about the relationship of between space, right? Because these are spaces in which Target has entered into, right? In spaces that have been, previously disinvested. Relationship between space, Blackness, right, and capital, right? So if we understand what happened after the last season of uprisings, what can we predict based on your work about what might happen now? And just how do we make sense of all of that? Just a very small question, right? And then for chapter 5, and chapter 5 was one of my favorite chapters of the book. I think throughout the book, we witnessed the drama of the space, the drama of history. And in this chapter, we witnessed the tragedy, right? A tragedy that some don't see as tragedy, right? The consequences that follow when, as you write, quote, public spaces are transformed into consumption spaces, right? The chapter is about, as you write, quote, how the aestheticization of everyday life are linked to the control of space and place, and how Black people are managed, and how that management is shaped by decisions about where to house services and transportation decisions. As you say in the introduction, where physical imaginations of the street are enforced as linear, Blackness renders the street a site of paranoia, crime, danger, and excitement. For urban ethnographers, right, the corner is an iconic space, and I loved your meditation on the corner of H and 8th as you say, the afterlife of Old H Street. You open the chapter with the discussion of a new development project, AVEC. AVEC replaces an earlier project, the H Street Connection Strip Mall that was built 30 years earlier by the same developer, right? It is built on a spot with a troubled history. It signals, as you say, a brand new era. And you make a key distinction about time here. You write, the chocolate city of the H Street Connection era was a city of services for its residents. The post-chocolate city of the AVEC area is a city of amenities. And I thought that there's such a wonderful distinction that helps us to see and make sense of, as you said at the start, what's happening in cities all across the country. Yet it exists in a space where the relationship of Blackness to some services remain. Black people use public transportation to access some services in the area, and it becomes a sort of gathering place for Black people. And those without access to services, the unhoused, are visible and unseen in this linear space. And I want to talk to you, and the question that I have is about this term unseen, right? And you use the term the unseen instead of invisibility. And as you write, to unsee is to not see the color of people except through the lens of a problem. To be unseen is to be structurally embedded yet ignored, actively overlooked in favor of aesthetic representation in ways that occurred to me that actually subverts the rules of interaction, right? What Goffman described as the interaction order, the rules of civil inattention, right? In this way, to be unseen is a manifestation of anti-Blackness, right? To be unseen is to borrow from Sylvia Wintard, acted upon as if you are outside the universe of moral obligation, right? And so I want to ask you to say more about how and why, and how you came to the term and the concept of unseen, and the particular scene that you write about, a couple who is unhoused and ignored in the middle of a newly created sea of wealth and capital. And you write very powerfully, they are needed, but their needs are not met. They are unseen, yet hypervisible. And so that term really resonated with me. And so I'd love to hear you say more about that. And so I have more to say, but I'll stop there to open it up and just to have you share a bit in response. And if you could respond to those two questions as well.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. Amazing to hear how you read the book, and especially as a sociologist. And so I was critical of sociology in the book. I didn't go overboard, but I was very clear about sociology's limitations in dealing with not just Black people, but Blackness in particular, and also thinking about Blackness in spaces. And so I really do appreciate, I'm glad we're recording this because I want to go back and listen to what you said. But thank you, Nikki, for reading it so closely and really pulling out a lot of the points that I was hoping to make, and especially clarity in terms.
Yes.
Because neoliberalism is thrown around so just with reckless abandon, you know, and it's funny because when I was in grad school and my dissertation had neoliberalism in the title, and one of my advisors, Dana Takagi, was like, neoliberalism is over. Like, we're not talking about this term anymore. And I still felt as though it was really relevant. And so I had to be really clear about how neoliberalism and race work together, but specifically how neoliberalism and Blackness work together in this urban context. And so that's why it was so important for me to hold on to it. And thinking about, as you mentioned, these Black subjects, these Black neoliberal subjects that exist, you know, throughout the book, these characters that are very much promoting market-oriented solutions to supposedly save Black people in the city while really ignoring what they actually need. And so I wanted to be I was very intentional about keeping that term in there and explaining what it was. Also, gentrification is one of those terms that we really just throw out. Everything is gentrified, right? And so I think there's a real specificity to how we have to understand it. Interdisciplinarity really kind of helped me think more about the meaning of gentrification and why, you know, I'm not just going to listen to economists and how they propose that particular definition, or in a lot of cases, sociologists even. I explicitly do say that gentrification, specifically in the American context, has so much to do with removing Black people. And I think that's important to state. And so I'm glad that also came clear. So I appreciate that. And also your big questions. So I think I'll take the second one first. And in terms of the unseen. So, you know, I had read the book, The City and the City by China Miéville, and I don't usually read sci-fi books at all. But I came across this one and I read it and it was like, oh my God, this is H Street. And if you haven't read the book, you know, the interesting part is the fact that there are two cities that are literally intertwined. They're mapped upon each other. And one city is this gentrified, sanitized, you know, artistic, this cultural haven where the wealthy get to roam. And then the other is this disinvested, impoverished, one that has terrible infrastructure and a lack of services to provide for the people who are living there. And they exist in the same space, the same streets, the same buildings even. But the residents of each city they are learned, or they are taught to unsee each other. And it's active. So it's not about invisibility. It is literally the act of not seeing someone intentionally. And if you see them, there is a breach. And there's this authority called breach, not the breach, but called breach with a capital B, that comes in and essentially kind of whisks you off away from both cities, right? And so there's this way that breach is always surveilling, always watching, always creating this invisible boundary and structure that has these cities that are on top of each other really intermixed, but at the same time operate separately. So yes, when I was on 8th Street, and I was there a lot, I came across this couple, and what stopped me is that they had a Lululemon bag that they had some of their belongings in, and they were just chilling, and it was hot out there. And so I just started talking to them, and they were also perched next to this light that had spray painted. There was an anti-gentrification image on one of the light posts. And so I'm sitting there talking to them, and I see 3 folks walk by, and they literally don't acknowledge us at all. And I'm looking, because I tend to, you know, nod or, you know, smile or something when people walk by. They didn't see us. Like they just walked by, and it felt intentional. It didn't feel as though they were engrossed in conversation and they just didn't notice us. It was as if they purposely kept their eyes forward, even though they were talking to each other. And it was really this sense that I felt constantly while being on 8th Street. And I started to talk to other people about it, where there was an intentionality to these two spaces existing in the same location. I knew it wasn't that Black people were invisible. Black people were very visible on 8th Street and had been for so many years. But at the same time, their needs weren't being met intentionally. It was as if you had to be folded into, assimilated in a particular way, but not necessarily. So I talk about these examples of various restaurants or cafes or boutiques that are opened. And while you'll see Black people on the street, plenty of Black folks on the street, you rarely see them actually in these establishments. So really, 8th Street could claim we're super diverse, because you see people of different hues, ethnicities, cultures, you know, nationalities that are roaming the streets. But really, it's this divide that's happening. And so the unseeing, I feel as though it was something that had to be learned, it had to be structured, and it had to be maintained. And so you see this through the planning literature, you see this through developers talking about the space and ways that they essentially are saviors to come in and really think about the city in a way that it was nothing before, we're making it something now, but layering it on top of the people that already exist, that are already there. And so the unseeing also ends up being important to me as I think about transportation and the ways that 8th Street, or at least the corner that I talk about, the corner of 8th and H, is the highest bus transfer point in the city. And for DC residents, the folks who take the bus the most, as in most major US cities, is Black folks. And so they're folks getting to their job, getting to their home in other areas of the city, or in Prince George's County or parts of Northern Virginia. And so to have the Department of Transportation maintain this location as a high bus transfer point while the rest of the corridor is gentrifying really spoke to me about how they wanted Black people to remain there, just in certain ways. So just pretend like they're not there, unsee them. They're not invisible, they're very visible. There are anti-loitering signs everywhere. There are ways that people are, again, watched, there are cameras. They're watched constantly, but they're still supposed to be, again, unseen, rather than having this kind of invisibility where if you're invisible, you're able to move, right? You're able to have these porous boundaries. The boundaries weren't porous on 8th Street. And it really felt that way as I was there, as I spent a lot of time there, and also as I talked to people along the way. So I still feel like that term, the unseeing, that to be unseen is really important in terms of how we think about a lot of things, especially as we're dealing with what's going on now in the Pandilution. And so that actually moves me to your first question. Making sense of right now. The one thing I've been talking a lot to my students about, especially my undergrads, is the priority of property over people, and ways that in this country, property has always been more important than people. And how that shows up is when you have a human chain protecting Target, right? Of all the businesses, Target. Now, I love Target. You can get everything at Target. But at the same time, when the world is on fire, when there is a burgeoning revolution, when there's opportunity to really bust everything up and start anew, the last place that people really need to be protecting is this global corporation. It makes no sense, right? But at the same time, it really speaks to how society is organized and how we're supposed to see, we've talked about how corporations don't pay taxes in ways like corporations are and aren't supposed to be seen as individuals or as people. But at the same time, they are, they provide jobs and they help develop the city. And there are ways that if a Target offers 100 jobs to a community, that's supposed to make us feel that's a salve for us to be okay about the fact that it might have taken over a space that provided other services to the Black, specifically poor and working class folks who lived there previously. And so what my book is really, or what I think can be useful from the book, is thinking about this as, yes, it's new, but it's also not new. It's part of this cycle that I think is continuing, and it's going to circulate unless we stop and really notice what's going on. And so that's why I think it's important to, as I identify the fact that Black people can contribute to this too, that it's not a matter of Black people know the answer and white folks are the enemy. It's not so much that, it's really interrogating what Blackness means, what whiteness means, and how power is really involved in creating these distinctions between the two. And especially as we think about white spaces and how whiteness is attached to white bodies and enables them to kind of freely be mobile and go and do whatever they want, that those power structures are what are creating the disadvantages that Black people are experiencing, and the ways that Blackness still maintains this, it's a commodity, but at the same time, it ends up being so much more. So that's why, I've written more recently about, the murals on the streets and the renaming of streets as Black Lives Matter, boulevards, lanes, plazas, etc. And even thinking about, as I talked to some friends about the fact that Black Lives Matter itself as a term isn't particularly radical. So to have to say that your life matters really isn't enough, right, in this context. That's actually something that's been said over the last 7 years as we think about, Trayvon Martin. And so it's a moment, I think my book is really trying to point out the ways that we don't need to do this over and over again. We actually have to call out how structurally this is embedded in society, and that it's not about pointing out individual racists, individual billionaires, but more so focusing on how they've been able to accumulate so much power and embed it in the institutions that are really kind of running our lives every day. So I'm still hopeful to have these conversations. And yes, I've been able to pull Bay out and talk about it and talk about Bay and the landscape. But I think I'm really trying to say so much more than identifying these instances of where you see Blackness as an aesthetic. Really, we have to think structurally about how this is ordering our society.
That's right. Thank you. And so I just want to remind folks, if you have a question, to add that to the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on that. And just to follow up on the what Target represents and the kind of the possibilities of thinking through what might happen next. And so one of the things that struck me in looking into this a bit more is in Minneapolis, an understanding of how Target was involved in expanding the surveillance infrastructure in the city, right? And so in a way that can be invisible to people. And I imagine that in the way that the Riot corridor became the Riot corridor, in part because it had the apparatus of protection from riots, right? And so the riot gates and so on. The protection that exists now in this moment will be the protection of invisible surveillance, right? And has the potential to kind of tighten the control and constraint, right?
Right.
And also the contradiction of that relationship of Target, like what you say, a global corporation, but also the contradictions that exist inside of Target, where I go, to the Target in Emeryville trying to get my, $15 lotion, and I have to get the manager to unlock it.
Right.
But if you go to Marin, you don't have to get the manager to unlock a $15 lotion, right? Last I checked, right? And at the same time, selling T-shirts that have like the names of Black freedom fighters on it, right?
Yeah.
But I'm particularly, and I don't know if you have insights on how you see that, the kind of physical representations of a post-riot world, and then what that might look like in these spaces, after this moment.
Well, I think one of the challenging aspects, and why I put riot in scare quotes and use uprisings or rebellion or revolution instead, is that when we use the term riot, it seems all encompassing and seems like it's this way to undermine whatever political activities are taking place to prepare. And for the folks who have known that this was going on and just needed kind of this breaking point to really get out there in the streets and organize. And so I think it's understanding how much we've been in crisis for so long, and that these are just moments of flare-ups. And so the crisis has been going on. There have been people who have been organizing, protesting, but haven't been heard or seen. And so it's only once there is large-scale destruction of property that the media, all these institutions, the media pays attention, the federal government pays attention, state governments pay attention, developers pay attention, right? But this has been going on for quite some time. I'm thinking about Marcia Chetlin's book on McDonald's, and thinking about this longer history and how capitalism is really embedded in the ways that, Black capitalism in particular, ways that Black people were involved in protests, and thinking about this relationship to McDonald's as this corporation that spreads around the globe, and also ways to contain Black protest and ways to commodify Black protest. So you see, like the example that you're given with the t-shirts that are on sale at Target, or the books. Now, they love putting up the How to Be Anti-Racist, or all of these books that really kind of speak to apparently this post moment where we can all learn how to stop being racist, rather than, again, looking at institutions, looking at structures, and understanding how they need to be undermined. And so we're not in a post-riot moment, right? Like, we are in crisis. We have been in crisis, and there are people who just aren't getting the national spotlight. And so what that means is sometimes we need to look more on a local level. We need to look in a smaller area. We need to understand how Black folks have been doing this work for so long, and that if the nation is watching, they're probably 7 months too late. There still is opportunity in this. So this takes me back to being unseen. There's opportunity in being unseen, not just invisible, but unseen, because that you're making this strategic, decision to not pay attention to folks. Cool. Then those folks can actually do that political work. Thinking about mutual aid as a form of being unseen, where you can actually create, it's a political process. It's a way to create these networks with people, but they may see it. And we saw, for example, at the protests when the police were destroying water, they were destroying food, right? So these aren't folks who are busting windows and putting up, the tagging walls. They were literally trying to feed and provide, water for the people who were out there in the streets. So it's more so taking these opportunities to continue that really important work, and not necessarily get caught up in this narrative that's circulating, because it's not necessarily the truth.
All right, so we have a question, but I do want to say, just full disclosure, I do have one of those t-shirts. And so I am a living contradiction, in the way that you write about as well, right? And so we are not without our own contradictions and flaws. And I also called the manager over when I saw that lotion behind.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the question: is the processes of Blackness as an aestheticization of space exceptional? Thinking of Elijah Anderson's White Space.
So I mean, that's a great question. And I talk about in a footnote, Elijah Anderson's white space and ways that I believe Anderson, what is the best way to put this, is relying on somewhat of a narrow notion of how we're thinking about space. And so it's like Elijah Anderson and other urban sociologists that I'm actually talking to in how they take space for granted. And so when I'm thinking about spatial relations, it isn't necessarily the built environment. It's not just public space, but it's also these intimate relationships in politics, and especially DC being the federal city and, you know, the chocolate city at the same time, that we can't take space for granted because, again, it's these two cities that exist on top of each other. And so it's not exceptional. I mean, it's not exceptional in the sense that it only happens in DC. It's exceptional in that it's intense, and it intensifies the race relations in terms of how it kind of gets reproduced in the production of space. It's exceptional in the ways that Blackness, again, you know, on this one hand has been celebrated, or at least Black art has been celebrated, but now it's really been taken and flipped on its head. And so I think that this is more of a contemporary phenomenon. It's certainly, there was a transition, and that's why, again, I do talk about this history and the transition of how Blackness was this kind of radical, powerful space that people could draw on and draw from, and then became more this, this object, this opportunity for the city to take advantage of what was happening. This is how you can have Black mayors instituting policy that supposedly support Black people, but really it's just they're taking advantage of the fact that they're, you know, holding on to the Black flag while at the same time destroying public housing, or not really looking into what affordable means in terms of building affordable housing. So I don't take Elijah Anderson to task in particular, but I do mention the ways that I think as sociologists, he and others take that kind of spatial concept for granted.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's a point that I made at the top, is that I think that's an accurate, you know, critique and a fair critique. And what I see, and I have been, you know, and so again, full disclosure, Elijah Anderson has been a wonderful mentor of mine, and I rely on the concept of white space a good deal, but it focuses on one type of relationship that is existing in a space at any given time. Right. And that is the interpersonal interaction. Mm-hmm. And what you were doing, what I felt reading your work, is a widening of that lens. The way that I've tried to grapple with this is to talk about the way that history lingers, right? And so the sets of relationships that we have in the space right now, right, are related to all that's happened before, and the battles over that space, and the political battles that took on so we live in the consequences of that. But I think what is exceptional is through the case of commercial real estate, you show the construction of that space and how people participate in the construction of that space, the contradictions that exist in doing so, and the consequences of that. And so, you know, so my quick response to this question, or at least how I see it as one reader, is that these coexist at any given moment. And again, who you are will determine where you focus your eye, right? And where you know, set your analysis.
That's right. I think that's right.
I don't think, in reading it, I don't think it's the same thing, right? It is in fact very different, and offers a different contribution that both complements and challenges, you know, urban ethnographers, right, me among them, right, who has, you know, taken space for granted, even as we're talking about settings, right? Right. So taking space and spatial relationships for granted.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I'll say, you know, it was really important for me to think about geography and right. ways that geographers don't take space for granted. Right. And especially in terms of thinking about how Blackness and these spatial relations exist and how they produce each other. And so, you know, I think oftentimes, and again, with sociologists and thinking about Blackness and writing about Black people, writing about gentrification in particular, there's this emphasis on the gentrifier. There is this emphasis on white people doing something or undoing something. And that I really wanted to move away from that. I wasn't interested in the gentrifiers at all. I had to talk to them. I had to understand various motivations. I did kind of want to see where they were going, you know, just as I was gathering information and doing the research. But ultimately, I didn't care, you know, what they were doing, what their intentions were, you know, why they felt okay about buying a house in this neighborhood. That didn't help me at all. It didn't help me understand, again, how the state was taking up Blackness, and how developers were taking up Blackness.
Right.
It really, I really wanted to understand, again, the structure and understand how institutions were embracing Blackness in this real way, but could not have Black people around. And we can look at, you know, the days of the forever mayor, Marion Barry, and how, you know, issues aside, there are ways that he really tried to think about what Blackness meant to the Chocolate City. From the days of prior to his election as mayor, the several times he was elected, but also once he was mayor, that he really was trying to think about what Black people needed. And to this day, folks love Marion Barry. Black people love Marion Barry, especially, you know, east of the river, love him because they got their first job, their first summer job through his program. It's that kind of stuff that matters. Not, you know, the dog park, not, you know, a spa or a health center or something like that. It's providing people something really basic, giving them places to be where they aren't openly surveilled, whether it's, you know, secretive or not, they know they're being watched. And so, you know, one of the, and I know you didn't ask this in particular, but one of the important points that I wanted to make in the book also was the significance of Black people just being there, just remaining there, being in DC. So you may not live in DC, but just the presence of Black people actually does something in terms of disrupting the two cities that are on top of each other.
That's right, yeah. And so I want to use that to segue to another question that I had in what you said about geography, right? Because I think that is the reason why the book is different, right? It is exceptional. And so if you could talk a little bit about the work of Black feminist scholars, Black feminist geographers, and how they informed your work. I think that at Berkeley, we've had folks like Javon Lewis who are expanding Black geographies on campus, and this is a reflection of what's happening more broadly. And you are contributing, you are part of that and joining the community as well. And so if you can just speak to how that matters, right, for the work that you do.
Sure. So, you know, I came to, so as I mentioned that this was in part my dissertation, not the whole thing. And it wasn't until I'd gone to a design conference at Harvard where it was a bunch of architects and planners were talking about Black space and how they conceptualize Black space. And I was really into it. I really enjoyed what they were talking about, but there was still something missing. Like there was still something that wasn't pulling it all together for me. So it was honestly, you know, once I went to the Black Geography Symposium that was in 2017, that I really, as I was writing the book, that I started to think more about how Black space, how we need to open up our designation of what Black space means. And so not just in the urban context of this ghetto or thinking about in terms of this transition or white flight and what that did, just disinvestment, but being more expansive in our understanding of Black geographies and how they're formed. And so for me, that really, Catherine McKittrick was really important in thinking about that and how she really brings the Black feminist lens to Black geographies to understand how different communities are produced, but also how Black geographies are kind of produced within this dialectic and how expansive Black geographies can be. So I also, the one thing I did, and she's not a geographer, but I used bell hooks a bit to think about aesthetics and to think about Blackness as an aesthetic, but also these vernacular issues around how Black people create space, produce aesthetics that can then be commodified or at least taken up, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the conversations that Bell Hooks has around, and then she's very explicit about aesthetics, very explicit about architecture. I think it's important to really understand this kind of communal and community aspect that both she and McKittrick really bring up in their work. And so that's why I think for me, it was better for my work to focus on these larger processes rather than the individual people. Of course, what that means is, you know, there's a lot that I would have wanted to do in the book, and that's focus more on individual stories, to do more ethnographic work from that standpoint, to give examples of how people were pushing back. But I didn't have room. The story, how it unfolded, was very different than what I had read about. And actually, I want to mention, you know, you said at the outset about how you would have written the book about U Street. And I was very clear that I did not want to write about U Street. U Street had been written about plenty, right? And so I felt as though focusing on H Street, this very everyday space, was this Black feminist project in that way, where it's focusing more, again, on the everyday, the mundane, not the exceptional, not entertainment districts, not the one that the history, where Stokely Carmichael, you know, went after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th and went and organized, you know, in Ben's Chili Bowl. That wasn't the area I wanted to focus on. I wanted to focus on that area that was so vital to Black life, but because it provided services, because you could go to get your vacuum cleaner fixed, because you could go to the grocery store, because you could go to the pharmacy there. Those were the Black spaces. Those were the Black geographies that were most interesting to me. And I feel that are often overlooked even today. It's the basic necessities that we're not necessarily meeting that go underserved. And in that way, that's how we're not able to create community or collaborate in meaningful ways. So certainly I was inspired by those particular directions, inspired by their theories and how they think about Blackness and how they think about Black community, Black landscapes, Black geographies, but then also trying to incorporate a more structural analysis and understanding materially where Blackness shows up in these contexts.
Yeah, thank you. And so if there are any more questions, add them to the Q&A. And I want to ask another question. You know, you write in the conclusion about, you know, being born and raised in Oakland, right? Yeah. And so I'm curious, and you say a little bit about this in the conclusion, but I'm curious about, you know, how the work that you've done informs how you see Oakland, and the kind of, you know, both the scholarly analysis and the personal dimension of it that is an important piece of Black feminist thought, right, and knowledge production, the emotional dimensions of seeing the transformation of your city. So if you can just speak a bit about that.
That's been the hardest. It is hard to come home and write about it. And I think part of it is methodologically, I have to make it a personal project in order to really capture, you know, not just what I was saying in Black in Place, but also how I want to think about reclamation and how I want to think about space in Oakland and how I want to think about the Black city that doesn't rely on Black people. So it's pushing that idea forward and still imagining how Black geographies can be created even in a space where Black people are literally disappearing. And so what that might mean, you know, for me, it's been paying more attention to the unhoused and understanding where the unhoused exist, specifically in Oakland, and policy that is supposed to be, you know, addressing the problems, but instead are really looking to build more unaffordable housing, and then also understanding how Oakland exists as a Black city in ways that don't necessarily encompass the Black Panther Party, or that don't necessarily have us thinking about more iconic representations of what Black Oakland is and was. So, you know, I think the exploration, thinking about DC first, was important for me because it is this larger than life city. The federal city, the chocolate city, the first chocolate city, it was important for me to kind of figure out what was going on there in order for me to come here and think about Oakland's relationship to San Francisco, to think about Oakland's relationship to the exurbs, like all the different, to Berkeley, to El Cerrito, to San Leandro, and understand how Black people are still here. Like Black folks are still in Oakland despite the numbers. So I do struggle though, because so much of my work has been separating the personal from this. So I'm that's why I said methodologically, it's like I'm not actually doing the Black feminist work. I'm trying to create this distance. So I have to really kind of break down those own barriers for myself in order to really get to the heart of what I want to say. I think that's also the difference with this book, that with the H Street book, I didn't know what I wanted to say. I went into the field and discovered and was learning and picking up, and all I knew was that I wanted to know about Blackness, and I wanted to understand how Blackness was still meaningful in this kind of post-Obama context. Now I know what I want to say about Oakland, so it's just a matter of figuring out where I need to say it or where I need to locate it, because I know it's there already. So yeah.
One of the things that strikes me is just my very casual observations of Lake Merritt over the last couple of years, and certainly since the barbecue Becky incident, is the reclaiming of Black space, and also feeling as if at some point it's going to reach a tipping point for the city, right, and that is happening in the midst of what did you call it, the Pandalution
or the Revelemic,
right? Which allows, I think, for some easing of space or some opening, but the idea that when the city gets back to normal business, that there might be some, some efforts at containment, and harsher efforts of containment, and that may be just the live what it means to live as Black, to be anticipating that eventual effort. And I think there's a lot of evidence that is the potentiality of that coming.
Right. And I think in a lot of ways how I've been imagining how Black people specifically have been living in the Bay Area, it's thinking about adaptation. It's like you adapt to what's happening. There are ways that Oakland is so economically regressive and has been for so many years, and just the it's infrastructurally, Oakland has its issues, right? And it's unfortunately placed an undue burden on Black people. And so, yes, the changes over Lake Merritt, which in a lot of ways has been the sanctuary for young, specifically Black people, and to think the irony of it being this like first wildlife sanctuary, also being the sanctuary for Black folks, and how that area is being taken away. And so you see people trying to, for example, with the Barbecue Becky incident, it's the barbecuing while Black, people selling their wares, along the lake. And just like with the book, so much of my research ends up being on accident or just because I'm randomly walking somewhere. So I happened upon, when I was visiting Cal, actually last year, I happened upon the Barbecuing While Black festival. It wasn't a festival, they do it every week where they sell wares, right? I didn't know about it. So I just happened to talk to some of the vendors and find out what was going on. And they were telling me, we were taking this as an opportunity. We're taking the space back, and we're thinking about like Black entrepreneurs really being able to take advantage of this opportunity. And, not just Barbecue Becky, but also remember Jogger Joe, who ended up taking the belongings of an unhoused man and throwing them in Lake Merritt. So that happened not long after Barbecue Becky. And so again, these ways that you have so think about white space, white people trying to dominate based on these logics of white space, right? In order to take over a sanctuary, a Black sanctuary. And so again, I think literally having Black people in the street, or whether it's selling their wares or not, still being at Lake Merritt is really crucial to maintaining this designation as a Black city. I have been thinking and writing more about, like, after the protests that happened along Broadway and Franklin in downtown Oakland, and the art that went up in their wake, right? And so thinking about how there's still this need for visibility and accountability, not just, having Black people there, but also holding the state accountable for making policy decisions that don't support Black life. I think there's really potential for that to still happen. And so in thinking about, this future, it's not necessarily just focusing on the past, or honestly, I hear so much about people wanting to hold on to stories or being able to tell a story. I do think that's important, but I also think it's important to think more expansively about what the future can look like. And it can't look like the past. We have to do something different. So if it's making the sanctuary, like the sanctuary on steroids. If it's creating spaces and overpopulating, then that's what it has to be, in a way to really make the system overflow, to overwhelm it. I think that might be the only way we can do it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the idea of overwhelming, because it does seem that like that is the process of what's happened, or an accurate description of the process of what's happened at Lake Merritt. I've lived in Oakland since 2010, and to visit, and visited the lake a lot, and it does feel like, it's just overwhelming presence of Blackness in the wake of these incidents. And the incident with the unhoused person, I don't recall that one, but there were a number of incidents before Barbecue Becky, right, and that made this kind of a tipping point. So I look very much forward to the work that you're going to produce on that. And so let me be a good moderator and go back to this question here. So could you draw out the implications of your analysis of the movement from Blackness to diversity beyond urban space, perhaps in other important social institutions?
The university is certainly one where we can think about that. And that's happened over many, many years. And that can be, we see it demonstrated in, the booklets that they would send out to encourage students. That was back when you still had to apply like paper copies. So that's been happening since I was going to college, where I'd see the pamphlet and it would show people from every country, represented by certain garb or skin color, to represent the fact that this campus is diverse, you belong here too. And so diversity ends up taking Black people's place, right? So where now you don't, in terms of affirmative action, you don't have to have the Black person, you just have to demonstrate that there is diversity. The problem with diversity is that it's unwieldy. It can become anything. So diversity can mean so many different things. It never means white male, right? Or unless there's some kind of, well, actually, that's not true. There are ways in which being a white man can be seen as diverse, right? Various abilities, right? If we think about various abilities and disabilities. But ultimately, because we're not focused on Black, and Black ends up just being one, thread in the tapestry, you're able to overwhelm Blackness with diversity, instead really keep Black people out. And so, yes, institutions like the media, universities. Think about the major institutions that really run our lives, or that we really contribute so much time and effort to. All you have to do is show a Black face sometimes. That's what they talk about just in terms of like Hollywood, or thinking about, film production, where you don't have Black people behind the camera. They may be plenty in front of the camera, or specifically fashion. I've also written previously about the high fashion industry, and ways that the fashion system will be racist for a long time because it is built on these differences. It's built on it. The system is built on it. So you can't just have Black people running down the runway or on the cover of a magazine and think that racism has been solved by diversity, right? It's really understanding how you have to incorporate, or at least understand how we think about Blackness, but then also have Black people in every area, because we do have that adaptation that we have to do requires us to understand these different facets of life. So the institution only using a Black person to stand in for diversity really does undermine the true intention of inclusion, honestly. So all the DEI stuff, all the corporations that hire HR managers to run, anti-bias training and implicit bias training and, diversity training, are really hinged upon this very generic and slippery concept of diversity.
I'm also thinking about the way that these efforts, any kind of opening it can be quickly enclosed upon, right? And as you're talking about the media, I was thinking about Issa Rae and Insecure, and her setting that show in Inglewood, and a story that she tells about on the show, having a gentrifier describe it as I would, and then now IRL in real life, people are describing it as I would.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we think about that relationship between, this is really all about representation, right? And so how different spaces are represented, or it is this kind of thinking about the simulacra, like these ways that
I'm gonna say that 10 times. Simulacra.
how Blackness stands in for Black people. So how the Black Inglewood, or at least I would, stands in for the Black Inglewood, because it means that you have this connection to this mythic past that most people don't know anything about. And so that's somewhat different than, you know, as we're thinking about, there are neighborhoods in Oakland that I don't know what they are. When someone will say a neighborhood, I don't know it because I'm not familiar with that particular moniker. That was certainly the case in DC. All the, like the NOMAs and the Atlas District, which is 8th Street, this new way of identifying the space in order to, on the one hand, think about its past only in this very particular way, this very nostalgic, positive way. And then to think about this future of being hip, urban, cosmopolitan, and forward thinking, futuristic, right? But again, it's that middle part that gets erased. It's that everydayness that gets erased. Again, the mythic history is what seems to matter the most.
Well, thank you. I could keep talking to you all day. We have 3 minutes left. I was about to wrap it up, but I saw one more question.
Okay.
So let's see, since we're talking about Issa Rae, can you talk about the politics of Insecure and other shows that participate in a kind of Black on Black gentrification? We need a whole nother hour for that.
No.
And projection of a particular bourgeois romanticization of neighborhoods like South Central without having meaningful attendance to working class people who live there.
I mean, you know, I think that speaks in a lot of ways to what I was talking about, where Black people can be the perfect neoliberal subjects, just like white folks can. And so yes, it is a particular bourgeois romanticization of these neighborhoods saying, I mean, this happened in DC too. There are parts of Southeast where folks kind of go middle class, upper middle class Black people end up being gentrifiers, in that, you know, they're thinking about potentially going into this home and its value being raised, and then essentially them leaving. They don't necessarily have the intention of staying there. I certainly think that's the case with the cast of Insecure, where they're young, they're, you know, a lot of them aren't partnered, or, you know, they may not have a family. And so they're able to stay in the dunes or stay, you know, in their apartment building until they've made it and can move out. And I don't even know what's popping. I don't know if Ladera Heights is still popping. I don't know what's popping in LA anymore. But there is this way that Black people still can buy into this neoliberal fantasy. It's race blind in that way. At the same time, they are kind of linking, or at least attaching themselves to a particular form of Blackness. So even the block party that she was having was drawing on this nostalgic understanding of what kind of street culture and ways that Black people have had these festivals, trying to harken back to those days. But at the same time, there's a very much a bourgeois aesthetic that is rampant in shows like this, despite the fact that they're trying to connect to a Black audience. So I don't know that, well, I do, but there aren't many shows or films, I think, that capture the everydayness and the quotidian that I was talking about. What I'll say is, I do think some do, and most recently, this film Residue that I keep talking about, that's about gentrification in Washington, DC, I think does it expertly. And it's fantastic and on Netflix, and you should watch it. But I think it really gets to the texture of what I'm talking about in the book, and ways that, you know, this romanticization of Black space by Black and white people alike really ignores and unsees the people who have been taken advantage of, exploited, and really kind of invisibilized in this particular landscape, whether it be from, you know, the cranes and the construction that's happening around DC in this case, or it's the folks who have tricked out their row houses to put rooftop areas to have cocktails and have people over, right? Ways literally that the architecture, that the structure, the design of the city is changing in order to make way for this different type of lifestyle, and who that is, what people those construction projects are built upon. Literally. So we have this expansion of the prison industrial complex where people are sent away. And then when they come back, their homes are no longer recognized. So those aren't the stories that are able to be told in a way, I guess, that make people feel good. And so they're not necessarily popular, but I do think that's happening in some ways, and go see Residue if you haven't seen it.
All right. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope we have many more conversations. I'll be teaching your book, so I'll be inviting you in to talk to my class.
Happy to do it.
And you know, it's exciting. You know, it's exciting doing the work that I do to see the city in a new way. And so I really appreciate all the work that went into producing this book. And thank you for telling that story.
Thank you. Thank you. You asked some wonderful questions, and I want to talk to you again about how well you saw it. So that was great. Thank you so much, Nikki.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, it is Nikki who suggested to have a conversation rather than a panel, and you know, I think that today's brilliant exchange was certainly a proof of concept. So thank you both for a rich, substantive dialogue about the contradictory place of Blackness in public space. And for a point, and Brandi especially for a pointed and novel and structural, very much structural critique of the phenomenology of gentrification and diversity. So thank you both. Please join us again as soon as next week. Subscribe to our newsletter and even follow us on Twitter. Goodbye.
Thank you.